More. We want to turn now to Lawrence Rubin. He is an associate professor at Georgia Tech's Sam Nunn School of International Affairs. He joins us now live. Professor, can you hear us all right?
Yes, I can. Can you hear me?
I can. Thank you for making the time. We've got a lot to talk about here. Let's start with this. We're now on day 12 of this conflict. As you undoubtedly have been watching it unfold, what do you judge to be the status of this conflict now that we are into the second week of it?
Well, that's a tough question because I think it seems like it changes almost by the hour of which direction it's going. One thing's for sure, there's been a lot of death and destruction, and in particular, it's seems like it's starting to hinge on the price of oil and energy markets as to how long or how far this conflict's going to last. The other thing it's hinging on also in terms of the target set that both sides seem to be engaged in.
Professor, you bring up a lot there. Let's unpack it because this is an important topic. And again, really glad that you took the time to talk with us here. Let's talk about the impact on global oil markets. We saw the stock market fluctuating remarkably over the last 24 to 48 hours here in the United States. How is this conflict impacting the global flow of oil and liquefied natural gas?
Well, I think there's two things. One is in terms of what it can do to the flow to the markets and the threat that it, and this is often what the how the markets react, and it certainly sent them into the price of oil to skyrocket, but also based on any type of political message of how long this conflict is going to last will affect the price as well. There have clearly been restrictions because of supply, and then that thus affects the prices we pay at the pump in that way. But there's also been a lot of messaging about how else more supply can come to the market.
Professor, the focus right now and a lot of conversation is on the Strait of Hormuz, a critical choke point. Something like a fifth of the global supply of oil on a typical day flows through that choke point that's only, I think, at its narrowest, about 22 miles wide. How significant is that stretch of the Strait of Hormuz in this whole conversation about oil prices and the conflict more broadly?
It's extremely significant. It's just as you said, one fifth of the global supply of oil goes through this very, very narrow strait. So that if you restrict this, and it's been talked about for years, even debated about would the Iranians actually do this to basically hurt themselves in some capacity? And we're seeing these types of threats and the attempts at mining this area too, to I think the Iranians are potentially banking on limiting the time this conflict will last. The hard part of this conflict will last. So it becomes intolerable for the world and potentially the American public. This might be part of their strategy.
Professor, whenever there's a conversation about oil prices, about conflict in the Middle East, folks sometimes, particularly here in the United States, think back to the Jimmy Carter years, his presidency, the oil and gas rationing that took place in the United States during that era. We're in a different place now, all these decades later. The United States now is an oil producer, not particularly reliant on oil coming out of the Middle East. Why and how does what's going on in the Middle East still come to impact the prices that people potentially are going to be seeing at the pump here in the United States?
Right. So that's a great question, and it's really just how it affects. It's a global commodity in this sense. It's affected by what goes on in the world, what we have or pay, and these are just one of the reasons why the United States has been so involved for years, even when it was dependent on this oil, was just because of the importance of maintaining the safety and stability of energy markets. It wasn't about going into the first Gulf War, about acquiring the oil for itself, but it was really about protecting the safety and stability of these energy markets so that they aren't volatile and that businesses can thrive, and also so it could sustain the global economy. So this is all part and parcel.
What nations are most vulnerable right now to, and perhaps I could rephrase this, which nations are most reliant on the oil that is typically flowing through the Strait of Hormuz?
Well, probably the nations that are most susceptible in a certain sense to these types of energy supplies might be, one among them might be, or watching it might be China, although China has diversified a lot of its supply. But a significant percentage, and I'm not 100% sure on this, comes from the region. And so it is watching very, very closely what's happening. Others also may benefit. For instance, the Russians may benefit if can get the oil out by supplying, because the costs for it's going to make more money when it comes to the higher costs of oil, even if it's heavily sanctioned. There are other also India is another energy importer as well too. So there we have a number of countries in the world, and really important countries that will that have a lot of stake in this matter of how the outcome will be.
It is an understatement to say that the world's eyes are on this conflict right now. More regionally, we have seen an expansion of the number of countries involved in the conflict, particularly as Iran's retaliatory strikes have struck a number of Middle Eastern nations in response to the U.S. and Israeli initial airstrikes. As you watch this unfold, Professor, what do you make of the potential risk of a larger and metastasizing regional conflict?
Well, it's already touched many countries, and if I'm not mistaken, it might be up to 11 that Iran has struck out against. So, in that certain sense, it's involved many countries. The question is how much further will it expand into the Middle East region, and it may take more intense fire from Iran to bring others involved into this conflict. I think there's been a lot of talk about Gulf states being more involved directly, and I'm sure that, and obviously they're involved when it comes to supplying personnel and other areas that kind of go under the radar. But there's been a fair amount of discussion of them becoming directly involved if more of these attacks continue, almost in a sense because they feel like they have to do something, and just can't let the United States and other Western powers defend them, and that there needs to be something that they do for themselves.
What, in your view, would be a precipitating point to trigger and push some of those Gulf states to, as you put it, take more offensive action against Iran?
Well, one might be higher civilian casualties. These are kind of some of the surprising moves that Iran had taken, was to target some civilian areas in some of the Gulf states, and this really drew the ire of not just the leaders, but I think some of the Gulf states' publics. That could be one measure. It may be, and I'm not sure that they've done this yet, some type of some aspect of cluster munitions, which can cause high civilian casualties, which have been launched against Israel already. But doing it against Gulf states would be something else. As I said, I think the trigger, or that red line, would be significant civilian casualties in one and among these states, and I think it would make it almost force the hand of many of these Gulf leaders to intervene in some more public manner.
Let's talk about timeline and potential resolutions to this conflict. Kind of the other side of the coin in the conversation is we're talking about the potential for a growing regional conflict. What, in your view, could be done to bring this conflict to an end? What are the end goals and end games for the parties involved?
I think external forces might be one to bring this conflict to an end, in the certain sense of other factors. Maybe it's the markets and so forth. I think the other thing is that the United States and Israel were aligned in a number of different ways, was degrading Iran's nuclear program, its ballistic missile capabilities, and took kind of different target sets. First, the Israelis are more about personnel, and the Americans were more about hitting some of these capabilities that it had the military capabilities to do so. Now, then it becomes, even though there's been a lot of talk about regime change, both the United States has messaged this, certainly the political leadership in Israel has messaged this. Now the question is, once you run out of those military target sets and you've degraded Iran considerably, what's next? And those kind of coming full circle to answer your question, this, along with what's going on with the energy markets, potentially the pressure at home in the United States, but also the unknown factor is Trump's willingness and how far he's willing to go on this. And again, this kind of, it's hard to read him. We've learned a lot from his second presidency, but this could also be personal. We also have plenty of evidence. We know that there had been assassination attempts against him, and there might be something personal where he might say, okay, I'm ready to, we want to end this fighting soon, and I'm sure he does. Is he willing enough to walk away to say, okay, Iranians, the Iranian people, now it's your turn. We've degraded we've degraded the military, actually the IRGC enough. We're walking away, and maybe they need to come back in another 3 to 6 months to do this again. But again, do they feel satisfied that they degraded enough of the nuclear capabilities as well as the ballistic and other military capabilities?
You bring up the topic of regime change, which has been a central thrust and focus of the discussion surrounding this conflict. Rewind the clock a little bit. A few months ago in Venezuela, we saw the United States military carry out a late-night, overnight kinetic operation that effectively abducted Venezuelan leader Nicolas Maduro and his wife and took him back to the United States and started to prosecute him. He's sitting in a jail in New York City at this point. Is this that kind of regime change? Is that also possible in Iran? We saw the supreme leader was killed in that initial airstrike carried out by the United States and Israel. A new supreme leader has been selected of the theocratic government in Iran. Could things play out similarly in Iran as they did in Venezuela, or is it a different kind of situation?
I think it's a different kind of situation. Well, on the one hand, let me rephrase that. There are strong elements to suggest that it's a different situation in the sense of the clerical leadership. If it remains intact the way it exists, it would be hard to have another situation like that would be as compliant that it seems that the current leadership in Venezuela is. On the other hand, there may be others. If it's not the clerical leadership, for some reason it's been eliminated. There's speculation the IRGC might take over without this, and maybe somebody wants to cut some type of deal. I'm not sure how that's done domestically, but that's also a possibility too. And I think that's what some people, and certainly in the administration, are hoping for in one direction or another to kind of bring this to a conclusion of some sort. Now, I think the regime change that, of course, the Israelis and I'm sure the Americans would hope for is one that decides not to pursue a nuclear weapon. And this is, I think, the hard question. We're talking about a country of 90 million people, with still a significant military force that is ready and willing to crack down, as it's already massacred, as we understand, potentially 30 to 40,000 people. We're not even sure about the numbers. And that is still largely intact. And even if you degrade the heavy military capabilities that can project some power, you still have those capabilities that are able to repress its own population. And that's the population that would push for I think, a meaningful regime change.
And you reference the killing by the Iranian government of its own citizens, likely tens of thousands of protesters who were part of mass demonstrations against the Iranian government, the theocratic and dictatorial government of Iran. The president has called on the citizens of Iran to overthrow the regime after the airstrikes have concluded. What is the likelihood and feasibility of that kind of popular uprising taking place?
I really have no idea. I know a lot of people don't. I think a lot of people, when they look at this, they also want to. It's hard to put people's own desires and wishes into what they speculate is what might happen. I think it's a lot harder than for it to happen than people might think it is. Less likely, but again, there's. It's just a challenge. It's challenging to know in general. There's not a lot of information, incredible information coming out of Iran right now due to a lot of the restrictions and constraints that they're keeping internally on this. So it's really hard to know. And even if you did have a full amount of transparency about information, protests, social movements, violent ones in particular, that this is what's going to have to take place. These are also hard to know how the dynamics will play out. There's nothing that really can map or model any of these incredibly sophisticated operations that are not even planned or well planned. If you remember, only going back, I guess, 15 years ago to the Arab uprisings or Arab Spring, it was hard to know what was going to happen next. People got, including me, lots of things completely wrong by not knowing what are people actually going to do on the ground.
A lot to watch. We know you're going to continue to monitor it, as are we. Professor Lawrence Rubin with Georgia Tech's Sam Nunn School of International Affairs. Thank you for your time and your perspective.
Well, thank you very much for having me on.